While going through my late husband's woodworking shop 3 weeks after his funeral, I found a coffee can on the highest shelf. Inside was a key, a folded map, and a note in his handwriting. It said, "Go alone. Tell no one until you've been there." I stood in that cold garage for a long time before I understood that my husband, a man who had never once in 41 years kept anything from me, had been keeping this. My name is Leonora June Cassell, and I am 68 years old. I live in Montpelier, Vermont, in the same white farmhouse my husband Alden and I bought the year we got married, when the roof needed replacing and the porch listed slightly to the left, and neither of us cared because we were 27 and in love and certain that anything could be fixed with enough time and intention. We raised our children in that house. We buried a dog in the backyard. We sat on that porch every summer evening for 4 decades, watching the light leave the hills, not talking much, because after 41 years you don't always need to. Alden died on a Thursday in October, an aneurysm. He was in his workshop, which is where he spent most of his free time. Building things, repairing things, restoring furniture people brought him from all over the county, because he had the patience for it, and the hands for it, and the kind of quiet pride that doesn't need to announce itself. The paramedic told me it would have been very fast. I have held on to that fact like a stone in my pocket every day since. After the service, after the neighbors stopped bringing food and the sympathy cards stopped arriving, and my daughter came home from Denver for 2 weeks and then flew back because she had children of her own and a life that couldn't pause indefinitely, the house became very still. I had not understood before that a house has a sound it makes when one person lives in it instead of 2. It is not quite silence. It is something more specific than that. I waited 3 weeks before I went into the workshop. Some things you have to work up to. Alden was a methodical man, a retired mechanical engineer who had spent 30 years designing industrial ventilation systems, which sounds dull until you understand that it means he thought in systems, how things connect, how failure prospects, how you build something to last. His workshop reflected this. Every tool in its place, labels on the drawers. A wall pegboard where the outlines of each hanging tool were traced in permanent marker so that you always knew immediately what was missing. I started at his workbench. Then the filing cabinet he kept in the corner, which held warranties for tools, instruction manuals, receipts for lumber, nothing unexpected. Then I moved to the shelves along the back wall, working from the bottom up. The coffee can was on the top shelf, behind a row of paint cans and wood stain, in the corner where the light didn't reach. I almost didn't see it. I only got it down because I was reaching for a jar of linseed oil and my hand knocked against it. It was a standard Maxwell House can, the kind he kept miscellaneous hardware in. I pried off the lid expecting to find hinges or cabinet screws. Instead, a small brass key on a plain ring, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a hand-drawn map. Alden's drafting hand, careful and precise, showing a route from our house to an address in Barr, about 12 miles east, and a note written on a piece of his workshop stationery, the pale blue notepaper he used for estimates. Nor, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. Take the key to this address. Go by yourself. Don't tell the kids yet, not until you've seen it and had time to think. I'm sorry I didn't explain in person. I couldn't find the right moment. I love you. A. I read it once standing on the step stool. I climbed down and read it again at his workbench. Then I went inside, made a pot of coffee I didn't drink, and sat at the kitchen table until it was dark outside. Don't tell the kids yet. We had 2 children. My daughter, Piney. Her real name is Josephine, but we called her Piney from infancy, and it stuck. Who was 40 and lived in Denver with her husband and 2 boys. And our son Weston, who was 38 and lived 20 minutes away in Waterbury with his wife, a woman named Becca. Becca was a financial planner. She was sharp, organized, very good at her job. She had handled Alden's estate paperwork with an efficiency I had been grateful for at the time. I sat in the kitchen and thought about that note. Specifically, I thought about not until you've seen it and had time to think. Alden was not a dramatic man. He did not use words loosely. If he wrote "had time to think," he meant there would be something worth thinking about. I put the key in the pocket of my cardigan. I did not go to Bear that day. I needed to sit with it first. What I did instead was what I had been doing since October, moving through the house slowly, doing small tasks, trying to reassemble the shape of my days. I did the laundry. I called Piney, who asked how I was sleeping and whether I'd eaten anything. I watched the news. I went to bed and lay in the dark and thought about a note written in my husband's handwriting sitting in my cardigan pocket. And I did not sleep well. It was Becca who called the next morning. She called most mornings, which I had understood as kindness. She would check in, ask about paperwork, remind me gently that certain documents had deadlines, offer to come over and help organize. She had power of attorney over a portion of Alden's accounts, a joint brokerage account they had set up together 2 years earlier, after Alden had a mild cardiac event that turned out to be nothing but had frightened Weston enough that he'd asked to be more involved in the finances. At the time, it seemed sensible. Alden had agreed. I hadn't thought much about it. On the phone that morning, Becca asked if the estate attorney had been in touch yet about the investment account documentation. I said I hadn't spoken to him. She said she could handle that outreach if it would help, that she knew how to navigate these things, that I shouldn't have to deal with paperwork when I was still grieving. Her voice was warm and practical, the way it always was. After I hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a moment. There was nothing specific I could point to, just the particular quality of a question that already knows its answer. That afternoon, I drove to Bar. The address on Alden's map was a storage facility on the edge of town. One of those low brick buildings divided into rows of numbered units, the kind of place that holds the overflow of people's lives. The brass key had a number stamped on it, Unit 14. I found it at the end of the second row. The door opened smoothly. What was inside was not large. A workbench, a single folding chair, a shop light plugged into an extension cord that Alden had clearly set up over multiple visits. On the workbench, a manila folder, a portable hard drive, and a second envelope with my name on it. The handwriting was the same as the note. Precise, his. I sat in the folding chair and opened the envelope. The letter was 6 pages, written on both sides of the paper. Alden wrote the way he talked, without preamble, in ordered sequence, with careful attention to causation. He had the habit of an engineer. He documented things. It was one of the things I had loved about him for 41 years. What he had documented here was this. 14 months before he died, Alden had noticed an irregularity in the brokerage account. A withdrawal he didn't recognize, routed to an account he didn't know. He'd looked closer, then closer again. Over the following months, using his methodical engineer's patience, he had traced a pattern of transfers. Systematic, spaced in amounts that fell below automatic review thresholds, out of the joint account. The account that had been intended, in its entirety, for me. The transfers were not random. They were routed through a holding entity. A small LLC registered in Becca's name from before her marriage to Weston, and from there into accounts Alden had not been able to fully trace. His estimate, documented with the account statements in the manila folder, was that somewhere between $180,000 and $200,000 had been moved. He had not told me. He had been afraid of what it would do to Weston, to our family, to the grandchildren. He had been, he wrote, ashamed of his own hesitation. He had spent 14 months documenting and preparing instead of acting, and then his heart had simply stopped before he could find the courage to do either. "You were always the one who could hold difficult things without flinching," he wrote. "I am sorry I made you hold this one alone. The evidence is in the folder and on the drive. Trust yourself, you know what to do." I sat in that storage unit for a long time. I read the letter twice. Then I opened the manila folder and began to go through the account statements, which Alden had organized chronologically, each page annotated in his careful hand. Dates, amounts, receiving account numbers, cross-references to the printed emails he had found through a shared cloud account he and Weston used for family finances. I am not a financial person by training. I was a middle school art teacher for 32 years, which means I know how to explain things in terms people can see, and how to recognize when someone is showing you something that isn't quite right. Looking at those statements, I could see it. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew to look. I photographed every page with my phone. I copied the hard drive contents to my cloud account using the login information Alden had written on an index card taped to the inside of the Manila folder. He had thought of everything. That was Alden. He had been building this for months, and he had built it the way he built everything, so it would hold. When I locked the unit and drove home, I had made my decision. I would not call Weston. I would not call Becca. I would speak to a lawyer first. Not the estate attorney, who I now had reasons to be uncertain about, but someone new. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and began researching attorneys in Montpelier who handled estate litigation and financial fraud. I made a list. I eliminated 2 based on firm affiliations that connected to Becca's professional network, which I found through a combination of her firm's website and a local Chamber of Commerce database. I am a retired art teacher, not a detective, but I had learned from Alden that you verify before you commit. The third name on my list was an attorney named Miss Okonkwo, Adaeze Okonkwo, who had been practicing for 19 years and whose firm's profile described her as experienced in contested estate matters and forensic financial disputes. One review from a former client said simply, "She was calm when I couldn't be." That was the sentence that made me call. I made the appointment for Friday. It was Thursday evening when Becca's behavior shifted. She didn't call that evening. She came. I heard a car in the driveway around 7 and looked out the kitchen window and saw her silver Subaru. She knocked. She brought a covered dish, something from the restaurant they liked, in a container that was meant to look casual. An I was in the neighborhood gesture. She was very good at gestures. She came inside and we sat at the table, and she talked about Weston, about the boys, about how worried everyone was about me. Then she asked, gently and with considerable skill, whether I'd had a chance to look through Alden's workshop. Whether there were any old account documents or financial files I might need help sorting. I told her I'd been through most of it. Nothing unexpected. She held my gaze for a moment. Her expression didn't change, but something behind it did. Something recalibrated. She left 40 minutes later. I stood at the kitchen window and watched her back out of the driveway, and I thought about the fact that Alden's note had said, "Don't tell the kids yet, not until you've seen it and had time to think." He hadn't written "not until you've decided what to do." He'd written "had time to think," as if he'd known I would need the thinking time before I could even get to the deciding. I went to Ms. Okonkwo's office on a Friday morning in November. Her office was on the 3rd floor of a building near the State House, and she met me at the door herself, which I noted. She had a yellow legal pad, a steady manner, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting or checking her phone. When I finished, she asked if I'd brought documentation. I opened my bag and placed Alden's folder on her desk. She worked through it methodically, the way Alden would have. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Castle," she said, "your husband built a very thorough case." "He was an engineer," I said. "That's apparent." She looked at the statements again. He documented this the way someone documents a system failure. Every transfer, every receiving account, every timestamp. This isn't a suspicion, this is a record. She spent the next hour explaining what she would do. She would file a formal challenge to the account modifications on the grounds that the power of attorney had been exceeded. It authorized management, not transfer. She would request a full forensic audit of the brokerage account. She would also, based on the printed emails Alden had saved, submit a referral to the Vermont Securities Division, which handled financial fraud cases involving investment accounts. It would not be fast, she said. But the documentation was sound. I drove home and tried to return to the ordinary texture of my days, which was harder than it sounds. Grief has a way of making you feel like a stranger in your own life. You move through rooms and do things, and none of it entirely coheres. Adding this, the knowledge of what had been done, the effort of keeping it contained while the legal process moved was its own weight. Weston called on a Tuesday, not Becca, Weston. I had been expecting this. Becca would have assessed that a son calling his mother would be received differently than a daughter-in-law making the same call. She was not wrong. When I heard Weston's voice, I felt something in my chest that I hadn't felt when Becca came to the door. Something older and more complicated. His voice was careful, too even, the voice of someone managing himself. He said he'd heard I'd retained an attorney. He wasn't accusatory, not at first. He said he was worried about me, that I was going through a lot, that grief could make things seem different than they were. He said he and Becca had only ever wanted to help, that the account arrangement had been something Dad had understood and approved of. I let him talk. When he finished, I said, "Weston, I found the storage unit. I have the statements. I have the emails." The silence that followed was not a thinking silence. It was a landing silence, the kind that happens when someone realizes the ground has changed beneath them. Then Becca's voice came on the line. She had been there the whole time. "Nora." Her voice was lower than usual. "I need you to understand what you are doing. This is not just about money. If you pursue this, you will destroy your son's family. You will destroy your grandchildren's stability. Is that worth it to you? At this point in your life? At this point in your life?" I notice that phrase the way you notice a particular type of structural crack, not because it's dramatic, but because of what it tells you about the load bearing on the wrong places. "Becca," I said, "whatever we need to discuss, you can discuss with my attorney. Please don't call this number again for personal purposes." I ended the call. My hands, when I looked at them, were steady. I was surprised by this. I had expected them to shake. I called my friend Marguerite that evening. Marguerite Holst. We had been friends since our children were in elementary school together, which meant we had been friends for over 30 years. She had lost her husband 4 years before Alden died, and she had a quality I valued deeply. She said true things without requiring you to thank her for them. I told her everything. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always thought Becca counted things." "What do you mean?" I asked. When she came to family dinners, she would look around the room the way someone looks at an inventory. Alden's tools in the garage, the land behind the house. She wasn't being rude, she was just always doing a quiet calculation. I had noticed it too. I had never been able to articulate it before. The formal letter from Weston and Becca's attorney arrived 10 days after that phone call. It was efficient and civil, and proposed a settlement, a private resolution, structured as a family gift, in the amount of $60,000 in exchange for the withdrawal of all formal proceedings. The letter noted, near the end, that a protracted legal process could be costly and emotionally taxing for a woman in my circumstances. I brought the letter to Ms. Okonkwo. She read it without expression. Then she set it down. "They're offering $60,000, she said, on an amount closer to $200,000. Yes, that's not a settlement. That's a signal." She looked at me steadily. "They're more frightened than this letter sounds. People who are confident don't make offers this low." She also told me to prepare for escalation. People who make an offer and are refused tend to push harder before they let go. She said it matter-of-factly, without trying to soften it, which I appreciated. That evening, I went for the first time to a grief support group that met at the community center on Tuesday evenings. Marguerite had mentioned it 3 times over the past month. I had resisted it. I am not naturally inclined toward talking about my interior life in front of strangers, but the weight of keeping everything contained had begun to feel like a structural problem of its own. Something was going to have to give. There were 7 women in the room when I arrived. Ages ranged from early 50s to late 70s. They were not what I expected. They were funny and honest, and several of them had navigated estate complications that made mine seem, if not simple, then at least not singular. A woman named Claudette, who was 72 and had spent 2 years in probate litigation with her late husband's business partners, said to me over decaf coffee, "The first year, they test you. They want to find out how much you'll accept before you stop accepting." I drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not happiness, exactly, but the specific comfort of knowing that where you are standing has been stood on by others. And they got through. They came on a Saturday in December. I saw Weston's truck in the driveway from the kitchen window while I was making breakfast. They had not called. They had not texted. The not calling told me everything I needed to know about what kind of visit this was. Weston looked like his father. He had Alden's height and Alden's hands, and Alden's tendency to look at the floor when he was navigating something difficult. He wore an expression I recognized from his teenage years, a manufactured openness, the look of a person trying to appear uncomplicated. Becca stood slightly behind him, which was not her habit. She carried a box of pastries from a bakery in Waterbury that she knew I liked. The box sat on my coffee table for the duration of their visit. Neither of us acknowledged it. We sat in the living room. I poured coffee for myself, not for them. Having something to do with your hands matters in these situations, Weston began. He was sorry, he said. He was sorry for the phone call, for how things had gotten to this point. He and Becca had been under significant financial pressure, the business she'd tried to start 2 years ago, the cost of the boys' activities, the way everything had gotten more expensive faster than anyone had anticipated. He did not use the word theft. He said borrowed against what would eventually be ours anyway, and an informal arrangement Dad understood, and a timing issue, not an intent issue. He looked at the floor while he said it. Alden used to say, let the structure show its own weaknesses. Don't push too early, or you might miss where the real fault is. I waited. Then Becca leaned forward. Her voice shifted into something softer, more intimate, woman to woman, calculated in a way that was almost impressive. Nora, she said, I know this year has been devastating. Losing Alden, handling everything alone, it's too much for anyone. The last thing you need is to spend what time and energy you have left on courtrooms and depositions. You deserve to rest. You deserve to be with your grandchildren, with Piney, not in legal proceedings. She paused. If you let this go, we can make it right, quietly, as a family. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about Alden in that storage unit on the edge of Bar, making his careful maps, printing his statements, writing a letter he could not bring himself to deliver in person. I thought about 14 months of documentation, built by a man who loved his family too much to break it and finally ran out of time to find another way. I was not going to let that work mean nothing. What you took from me, I said, was approximately $200,000. The offer in your letter was $60,000. You've described that as something fair. So I'm asking you directly, what number were you going to propose today? Becca's expression shifted just slightly. The warmth didn't disappear all at once. It thinned. This isn't about a number, she said. It is entirely about a number, I said. It is also about the emails, the receiving account registered in your name before your marriage, and the transfers structured specifically to avoid automatic review. Those are facts, not feelings. My attorney has all of them. Weston started to say something. Becca touched his arm, a small, quick gesture, and he stopped. She stood. She picked up the pastry box. She did not leave it. We came to give you a chance to handle this with some dignity, she said. The warmth was gone now, fully, the way a room goes cold when you open a window in winter. You've said no. I want you to understand what you're choosing. I understand it clearly, I said. I think you should go. Weston looked at me, really looked at me, not at Becca for guidance, but at me. For one moment, he looked like the boy who had sat on the back porch at 12 years old, crying over a friend who had moved away, who had let me sit beside him, without either of us saying much. I had loved him in that moment with the specific gravity that children bring you before they become entirely their own. Then his expression closed. He followed Becca out. I listened to the truck back down the drive. Then I sat very still in Alden's armchair and let myself feel, for the first time without flinching, how afraid I was. Not of losing the case, of losing my son to his own choices, of spending the rest of my life watching him from a distance that he had created and I could not cross. Fear is honest that way. It doesn't pretend. But underneath the fear was something else. Something Alden had put there in 6 handwritten pages and a shelf full of organized evidence. He had known I could do this. He had been more certain of that than he had been of his own ability to do it himself. I picked up the phone and called Marguerite. The hearing was scheduled for the 3rd week of February at the Chittenden County Courthouse in Burlington. Ms. Okonkwo had spent the 2 preceding months preparing me with a thoroughness that I respected and occasionally found exhausting. We reviewed the documentation repeatedly. She walked me through the forensic accounting report that the audit had produced, which confirmed Alden's estimates and added 3 additional transfer events he hadn't documented. The total figure was $214,000. She told me what to expect from opposing counsel, a firm that specialized in real estate closings and had, in her professional assessment, limited experience with contested estate fraud. She also told me what to expect from myself. "You will want to explain," she said. "You will want to give context, to soften things, to help the court understand, don't. The documentation does that. Your job is to be present and let the record speak." I wore a dark green blazer and sensible shoes. Alden always said, "Dress for the work you need to do, not the work you wish you were doing." I arrived before Weston and Becca. I found my seat beside Ms. Okonkwo and folded my hands in my lap and waited. The courtroom was smaller than television prepares you for. Wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, with a particular institutional stillness. The judge was a man in his early 60s with a careful, neutral manner. He had, Ms. Okonkwo told me, handled a significant number of estate and financial fraud cases. He would not be easily impressed in either direction. That steadied me. They came in together. Becca wore a dark blazer and carried herself with the composure of someone who has decided that composure is the only card she has left to play. Weston walked slightly behind her. He had not looked at me in the parking lot. He did not look at me now. Their attorney opened by asserting that the transfers had been made with Alden's knowledge and verbal consent, that this was a family planning arrangement that had been mischaracterized in the documentation, and that my challenge represented a misunderstanding of my late husband's intentions. Ms. Okonkwo's opening was quieter and took half as long. She laid the documentary record out in chronological order, without commentary. Dates, amounts, receiving accounts, email correspondence. She let the numbers speak. The judge's pen moved steadily across his notepad during her presentation. It moved less often during theirs. During the first recess, I stood in the hallway with a cup of water from a paper dispenser and looked out the window at the February sky over Burlington. Gray and certain. The kind of sky that doesn't apologize for itself. When proceedings resumed, Becca was called to testify. She was composed and careful and consistent. She described Alden as having been fully aware of and involved in the transfers. She used the word collaborative several times. She spoke of him with a warmth that I recognized as performance, though I kept my face still. Miss Okonkwo cross-examined her on the email chain. Not all of it. 4 specific messages, the ones referencing completing transfers before estate complications arise and keeping Weston's exposure minimal. "Can you explain," Miss Okonkwo said, "how the phrase keeping Weston's exposure minimal is consistent with an openly agreed-upon family arrangement?" Becca said the language was informal, shorthand, not indicative of concealment. And the transfers were structured in amounts below the automatic reporting threshold. Was that also informal shorthand? A pause. "That was standard financial practice. For accounts you don't control," Mrs. Okonkwo said, "it is an irregularity. For an account you were not the primary holder of, it is a pattern." The room was quiet. It was the signature on the account modification form that finally shifted things, a form requiring my co-authorization. My signature that had been processed without it. Ms. Okonkwo placed it on the table and asked Becca to identify the signature in the co-authorization line. Becca said there may have been a processing error. Ms. Okonkwo asked if Becca was familiar with the relevant Vermont statute on financial document falsification. For the first time, Becca's eyes moved. Not to Ms. Okonkwo, not to the judge, to Weston. It was a small movement, involuntary, the reflex of someone who has run through their prepared responses and is reaching for a lifeline. Weston was looking at the table. He did not look back at her. Weston was called next. He was trying to hold 2 stories together at once, and the seams were showing. His account of Alden's verbal approval differed from Becca's in the date, the location, and the specific wording Alden had supposedly used. When Ms. Okonkwo pointed this out, placing both accounts side by side, reading them aloud, Weston looked at his hands. "Mr. Castle," Ms. Okonkwo said, "did your father explicitly and directly authorize in your presence the transfer of funds from his personal retirement brokerage account to the LLC registered in your wife's name?" He was quiet for several seconds. He understood what we were doing, he said. That is not what I asked. Outside the courthouse windows, February continued without any particular interest in what was happening inside. I watched a bird cross the gray sky and thought about Alden's workshop and the pegboard with the outlines of the missing tools, and how you always know immediately what is gone if you built the system right. The ruling came 5 weeks later. Ms. Okonkwo called me on a Thursday afternoon, and I drove to her office and sat across from her while she read the document. Then she looked up. Full restitution, she said. $214,000, plus your legal costs. The court has also forwarded the signature falsification finding to the Vermont Attorney General's office. I sat with that for a moment. The signature, I said. It constitutes document fraud under Vermont statute. It will be prosecuted as a separate criminal matter. I looked out her window at the buildings on Main Street, holding the afternoon light. It was March now. The snow was still on the ground, but the light had shifted. The particular quality of light that comes in the last weeks of winter when the days are getting longer, and the world is starting to remember what it knows how to do. I did not feel triumphant. I felt the way Alden had described a completed structural repair, not dramatic, not victorious, just right. The way a thing feels when it returns to the position it should have held all along. Miss Okonkwo slid the ruling across her desk. Your husband documented this, she said, the way someone documents a critical system, step by step. Nothing ambiguous, nothing missing. She paused. He trusted you to know what to do with it. He always trusted me more than he trusted himself, I said. That was his one irrational habit. She almost smiled. The civil judgment was enforceable immediately. Becca and Weston's attorney filed a motion for delay on the grounds of asset liquidity. The court granted 60 days. Ms. Okonkwo said the judgment would be paid. Given the assets available, it was a matter of willingness, not capacity. Willingness, she said, was no longer the operative variable. Becca's financial planning license came under review by the Vermont Department of Financial Regulation within 3 weeks of the criminal referral. I had not aimed at this. It was a consequence of the process, not an outcome I had sought. But she had used her professional standing and her industry knowledge and her access to financial systems to do what she had done. The license had not been incidental to it. It had been the tool. Weston called me once after the ruling. I answered because he was my son. Some things persist past the point of comfort. He sounded tired. Not the managed version, the real kind. The kind that comes from holding something together for a long time after it has already broken. He said, Mom, I should have. Then he stopped, started again. I told myself it was just money, that you'd be fine, that it was all going to come to us anyway, eventually. Don't, I said. Don't make that your explanation. He didn't argue. We were quiet on the line for a moment. I knew it was wrong, he said finally. That was the most honest thing he had said to me in over a year. I held it carefully. I love you, I said. And what you did was a genuine betrayal. Both of those things are true and neither one cancels the other. He said, I know. I ended the call and sat in Alden's armchair for a long time. Not happy, not unhappy. Somewhere in the complicated country between them, which turns out to be a larger territory than it sounds. Piney flew in from Denver the week after the ruling. She had known before the hearing. I had told her because she deserved to know and because I was tired of being alone with it. She had gone quiet on the phone when I told her. A long, specific silence. Then she had said, I'm buying a ticket. That was all. We sat on the porch on our first evenings, despite the cold, wrapped in the wool blanket Alden had bought the winter before, with mugs of tea that went cold faster than we drank them. The maple tree in the yard still had a few dead leaves attached, the ones that had been too stubborn to fall in November. She said Dad would have liked Miss Okonkwo. He would, I said. She shows her work. We sat with that for a while. A cardinal landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard, a male, that improbable red against all the brown and gray, and stayed for a moment and flew away. I kept the storage unit in bar. This surprised me when I decided it, and it surprised Ms. Okonkwo, and I imagine it surprised Weston and Becca, who probably assumed I would empty it and be done. But Alden had spent months building that space, coming back to it alone, adding to the folder, making his careful annotations. It was the last project he had fully completed. I was not ready to dismantle it. I had it cleaned and repainted, replaced the folding chair with a proper one, added a small bookshelf. I go there on Thursday mornings with coffee and whatever I'm reading, and I sit at his old workbench and look at the wall where the bare bulb has been replaced with a proper lamp, and I do whatever I like. Sometimes I read, sometimes I write, sometimes I simply sit and listen to the sound of the lot outside. A car coming and going, the particular quiet of a weekday morning in a small industrial building, the specific peace of a place that nobody else knows to find you. Marguerite and I started walking together twice a week, through the river trail on the north side of town, where the ice goes out first and the willows come in early. We talk about our husbands, about our children, about the accumulated ordinary weight of long lives and how you learn, eventually, to carry it differently. On one of those walks in late April, she said, "You seem like yourself again." I thought about that for a while. "I think I seem more like myself," I said. "I'm not sure the before version is who I was heading toward anyway." She considered this. Then she nodded, the way Marguerite nods when something is true. The tulips came up in May, along the front walk, the burgundy ones I planted the previous fall. A variety I'd never grown before, richer and darker than I expected. Alden had always tended the garden with the same systematic care he brought to everything else. He had kept notes on what he planted and where, with dates and observations, in a small green notebook I found in the kitchen drawer after he died. I've been adding to it. He used to say, "Measure twice, cut once." He meant it about wood, about engineering, about the patience required to do a thing right the first time. He meant it about how you read a set of plans before you touch the material. I think he also meant it about people, though he never said so directly. He was not a man who explained his metaphors. He trusted you to get there. The grief is still there. It doesn't go away. It reorganizes. You learn to move around it, to build new passages through the house that avoid the rooms where it sits heaviest, and then one day you walk through one of those rooms without bracing yourself first, and you realize the arrangement has shifted without your noticing. Alden was a careful man. He measured twice. He documented everything. He spent 14 months building a case he couldn't find the courage to deliver, and then he left it for me in a coffee can on a high shelf in a cold garage in October, trusting me to find it when I was ready and know what to do. He was right about that. He was right about most things. If your husband or your wife or anyone who loved you left you a locked door somewhere, go through it. You deserve to know what's on the other side. And when you find what's there, trust that the person who left it for you believed you were capable of handling it. They usually knew you better than you knew yourself. What would you have done in my place? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. Thank you for being here.